Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 7, Episode 28 of Music is Not a Genre. Let's do it, MxG. It's pretty tight, actually. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. If you are watching, you see I have a guest with me today, and we are going to get to that soon because this is BackTalk with Steve Erickson, Round 6, College Radio, and I'm very excited to talk about this subject. But first, as always, thank you for watching and listening. Those listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast, and please subscribe while you are there. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre if you would rather just listen. And everyone, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast, my band Rec, and everything I do. And all across the board, wherever you are listening, please like and share and subscribe and rate and review and all of that stuff. Two other announcements before we get started. As I have been saying for the last few weeks, I have a song coaching service now that I'm providing, songwriting coaching for anyone who is interested in pursuing that and doing a little bit more of that. Got a lot of experience. I think that we could work well together. Go to nickdimatteo.com/song coaching to find out more. And Rec's new album will be out worldwide on June 20th, Kite to Camden, which is now at recarea.bandcamp.com, will be distributed worldwide on June 20th. So this episode is debuting just before that. But if you go to nickdimatteo.com/discography, right there on at the top of the page is the Kite to Camden link. That link will have all of the links wherever it's distributed when it's active. So keep that in mind for June 20th. Now let's get to the topic. Again, it's BackTalk with Steve Erickson, Round 6, College Radio. Steve, how are you today?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Not bad. Not bad. I'm very confused by the weather, but otherwise pretty good. Yeah.
Is your air conditioning on?
No, but I broadcast from the basement, so it tends to be a little cooler here. And we tend to not need to turn it on until it's hitting the 80, mid high 80s. So, fingers crossed. We'll see.
I think we're there though.
I think yeah. I'm a little slick maybe. So we had been talking about this off and on for a while, and we tend to talk about things like charts and radio, and in part because you have been doing your own radio show on Mixcloud, and you're going to be at I guess what we call a terrestrial radio station very soon. And we're going to talk about all of that towards the end of this. And I will provide a link to everybody so you can listen to Steve's incredibly eclectic and diverse and yet very cohesive shows. But that kind of brought up the subject of radio in general, and in particular, college radio. So we're going to go through a little bit of the history and developments there, and then talk about, comparison of what it was like in the 70s, 80s, 90s, today, and other charts and other, radio formats as well. So I guess starting at the beginning, do you want to talk about when college radio began?
Yeah, it actually started in the 1920s. The FCC started giving out licenses to colleges for typically 10-watt AM stations. It was intended to supplement their educational endeavors, like they would broadcast lectures and things like that. I don't think music became that big a part of it. The next big step for college radio came in the 60s when the FCC started licensing FM stations. There was a big boom of FM in general in the 60s because the sound quality is better than AM. That's why now AM is almost nothing but talk radio, because it doesn't matter as much if it doesn't sound as good versus playing music. So the Yeah, in the 1960s, the FCC started licensing typically 100-watt FM stations at colleges.
So, starting in the 1920s, as you mentioned, I think you had a note that the University of Connecticut began broadcasting in 1924. Is that right?
Yeah, I mentioned that because that I grew up about 20 miles south of the university, and I listened to that college station a lot when I was a teenager. So I did, but I didn't know that its history went way, way, way back.
Yeah, I saw quite a few of those listings. There's some dispute as to when actual radio broadcasts started. Some listed as far back as 1909 with KCBS News, and some say it wasn't really until 1920. And there's a note that's I think some classical piece was the first piece of music ever broadcast on radio. But what that means is if you say it's in the area of 1920, and I saw a lot of other college stations listed on the page I was looking at that also started that far back, sometime in the 1920s, then we've had college station for over 100 years.
Yeah, the part of the idea behind it was also part of the reason why public access cable exists. That if you college stations are restricted to the lower four from 88.1 to 91.9, but that section of the band of airwaves is reserved for non-commercial broadcasting, just like every cable company is supposed to have a public access channel.
I didn't know that. Wow. Okay. I know you mentioned the, there was AM and then FM, and what I always grew up knowing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that AM's signal is weaker but spreads farther, and FM signal is stronger but is has a more narrow spread.
I'm not quite sure about that, but
I think that when I'm driving cross country, I've found in general that AM stations tend to last a little longer, and
oh,
yeah, the sound is crappier. But FM, it punches you in the ears wherever you are in whatever city, and then it disappears within 20 miles or something like that. So but that's interesting that so the bottom part of those numbers, people, if anyone out there who's listening or watching still bothers with radio, which I, recommend even beyond Sirius XM that you give it a shot. That one of the things I love doing when I'm traveling is just scanning, the dial and seeing what's out there. We just say, oh, this station's here and this is 102 and this is 98.1 or whatever it is. I was unaware that they were divided in that way. That the lower numbers were for non-commercial stations.
yeah, if you're driving and you wanna see what college radio in that area is like, just twist the dial below 92 and you'll find it.
That's very cool. And come to remember, the college stations that I listened to in my hometown in South Jersey were at the lower on the dial. So yeah, that totally makes sense. And I can see how it connects to public access, which I think we'll bring back a little later as well, because there is to me a connection between college radio and independent stations that are not affiliated with a college, which is more similar to public access TV. And I do want to get there, but I'd like to continue kind of with the history first. So in between 1920 and then, when the FCC licensed the FM, channels in the 1960s, do we know that it just sort of slowly spread across the country and across the world?
It did spread across the world, or it began in a lot of places around the world, also in the 1920s. For instance, in Argentina, their first college station launched in 1924. The UK had more regulation about radio because they wanted to direct people to the BBC, but they had a lot of pirate stations running from the 60s into the 90s. But I don't know a whole lot about the very early history of college radio. I'm actually surprised how little, I should say, a lot of our information about the history of college radio came from Catherine Rye Jules' book Live from the Underground.
Hmm.
And I was surprised that there's really a lot less writing about. I would have thought that there would be a dozen books like that, but that's the only really comprehensive history of college radio that I could find. And it was published just 2 years ago, although her chronicle ends in the 90s.
Okay, gotcha. Might be a yeah, and an appropriate time to end in some ways. But I found as well I found quite a bit of random information on college radio, some of it historic, some of it just listing stations, etc. Some of those links had histories of those specific stations, but there was nothing out there that kind of collated that information into a coherent history. So yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm a little bit confused about what happened after the 90s.
Well,
That
yeah.
that that's the period where college radio kind of, for better or worse, kind of there was a period where it was important to popular music, and a band like the Smiths could go gold just off college radio play.
Mhm.
And then there was a crisis when basically when Nirvana hit and quote unquote alternative music be- became as big as bands like Guns N' Roses and Metallica. And
Right.
college radio in a lot of ways never fully recovered from that.
And that is, I am really excited to get to that point because that was, I mean, I guess you could say that I must have some vague memory of college radio in the 70s, but really I kind of tuned in consciously in the 80s, literally and figuratively. And then, took that through the 90s and even somewhat beyond. So I'm excited to get to that. But let's go back to the 60s. We had that explosion, when the FCC, did what it did, and then you're coming into the 1970s when I assume there were more and more college, stations, and they were stronger because they were on FM and all of that, and it seemed like they started to take on an identity, which I don't really know what they were playing prior to this period other than educational things, but that they were leaning in more towards music. And as you kind of mentioned in your notes, true alternative music and blues and folk and even prog and we saw the first CMJ chart in 1978, and what an interesting mix that was. It was somewhat unexpected that there were so many what I thought of as mainstream acts, and yet it was a really diverse list.
Yeah, I actually found an extended version of that list that went down to 26 albums. Jimmy Cliff, I think, was number 25.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
Bruce Springsteen was number 26. That was the where it ended. But
Okay.
um, yeah, I think there was a big explosion of FM rock radio in the late 60s. And I think there, for a period of a couple years, there wasn't that much difference between college FM radio and commercial radio.
Oh, gotcha.
Both of them were really tied to the counterculture, and they were the DJ. You can find a lot of recordings from this period on YouTube and the Internet Archive,
Mm,
and listen to some of them. And even commercial stations, they would play popular artists like The Doors and Jimi Hendrix and Jefferson Airplane, but then they would play Muddy Waters or Nico or Tim Buckley or jazz.
mm.
But that eventually kind of turned into what became classic rock radio or the classic rock canon. But there was a tied to to in a lot of places to leftist politics and their communities where the DJs would talk about the Vietnam War, or they would bring on members of the Black Panthers for interviews.
Mm.
And I think over the course of the 70s, I think that the political element grad kind of gradually diminished, and the I d- we have an idea of college radio as kind of a format being actually in the 80s people called bands like Husker Du and the Smiths college rock.
Yep.
In the 90s that changed to alternative rock, and I guess we would now say indie rock. But
Yeah.
uh, that was not at all what college radio didn't really leap on board with punk and new wave initially.
Didn't do that.
No, or if they did, it was what a friend of mine did college radio around 1977, and he
Hmm.
said he was the only person who would play that kind of music, and he typically had to bring in his own, say, copy of the first Ramones and or Suicide albums.
Yeah, see, that's fascinating to me because whatever you want to say about the state of radio in the last, 40 years, how it's changed and, expanded and contracted, there always seemed to be a place for everything. If you looked hard enough, you could find a station that would play the most obscure genre, or obscure to mainstream people. And of course, all of the other stuff from the super popular pop all the way, and everything in between. It makes me wonder who was, if college radio wasn't playing that stuff in the 70s and in early 80s, who was playing it?
That's a good question. I don't, I was born in 1972, and I never really listened to the radio until I was about 12. So and my parents basically didn't like music whatsoever, so
Uh,
they never had it on. So when I was a child, yeah, I just didn't listen to the radio until around 1984. So
okay.
I don't really know what was played
Yeah.
anywhere until then. But I would really doubt that there were many commercial stations that would play folk music or reggae, except maybe Bob Marley, or blues. There were dedicated jazz stations, and
Yes.
continue to be, but that might be the big exception. And I think where you would really find independent labels and music outside the mainstream on college radio in the 70s and early 80s would be the folk or the reggae shows rather than the rock shows.
Oh, right. That's true because I guess I'm forgetting that, there's with college radio, as with a lot of independent radio and some mainstream, there are shows. So you might have somebody at, 3 a.m. who's finally playing the thing that you want to hear that they won't play at 8 p.m. or, 12 p.m. And so they must have had some DJs who were playing, an entire show of reggae or punk.
Yeah, I think that's still true on college radio to a large extent.
Yeah.
Research for the podcast, I looked up about 10 college stations and scrolled through their schedules. And
Hmm.
it's still the case that, for instance, one of them had 6 hours of Latin music every Sunday, or you'll
Whoa.
find a lot of blues. For instance, WFMU from midnight to 3 a.m. on Monday. I Monday into Tuesday. I guess technically it's Tuesday, but because the show starts at midnight,
Mhm.
there's a DJ who plays 3 hours of 70s R&B and soul.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's good to, yeah, and I mean, I don't peruse the channels enough or know what they're playing, but I was somewhat aware that, you could find a show for something that you wanted, which you can, I mean, you can do that online, but we're talking specifically about terrestrial radio here. And kind of going back into that sort of transitional period where, you shared with me that first CMJ chart, which, by the way, And I haven't even told you this yet, Steve, but the bonus M extra video for this at patreon.com/music is not a genre is Steve and I are going to take a look at that first CMJ chart, and you will be amazed at what's on there. So please head over to Patreon and check that out. That transition, I guess, from the 70s where it was phasing out of, like you said, the its crossover with mainstream rock and the politics and all of that, and it still had quite a bit of diversity, but it was entering into that era when stations were going to be more programmatic. I mean, they've always been programmatic, but really it was pre-clear channel and all of that, but still I remember in the 80s that you knew exactly where to go, which station to go to if you wanted a certain kind of music, which I assume was also true in the 70s, but it sounds like, there was a period during which you could hear, like you said, rock and then blue, like Muddy Waters right next to that. And that seemed to be phased out of mainstream radio. And over that transition up into like the mid 80s, where we started to get this idea of college rock being its own thing, that all of that more, maybe less genre specific and more eclectic stuff shifted over to college radio is when it took on the identity that we have come to know today.
Yeah, so maybe we should talk about the second chart, which was from November 1984. And on that one, you get artists who only got airplay on college radio in the top 10, like the Ramones, Let's Active, the DBs, Aztec Camera. There were some mainstream artists in the top 10, like I think you two number one on that chart.
I think
Also,
so.
David Bowie and Talking Heads were in the top 10, but they still had a kind of cool, I don't know, sense of coolness that, uh, uh, yes, we're in the 1978 top 10. They
Right.
they were never cool,
It's true.
or
It's a
or
very
at
good point.
the point they were never quote unquote alternative or indie.
No. Yeah. And yeah, that's true. We should compare those two charts. The difference in 6 years is fascinating. And I remember from that period, as I was phasing out of school and into college, that, towards the end of the 1980s, college rock became modern rock. And then modern rock in the 90s, like you said, became alternative rock or alt rock. And then, yeah, pretty much since I, you know, 2000s at least, we've been saying indie rock. And that period in the late 80s is it really is crucial. It to me, I'm reading a book right now, or honestly I can't remember where I got this from, but I think it was from that. Oh no, it's another podcast that I'm listening to, and he did an episode on basically alternative rock, and was talking about how in the late 80s it was still for the most part on college radio and thought of as college rock, and it was starting to trickle into the mainstream. It was in, I believe it was 88, 89, was it, that Billboard finally initiated a modern rock or alternative rock chart. I'm not
Yeah,
sure what. Yeah,
that was called Modern Rock at first, and yeah, the first one was 1988. I think
88.
when REM's The One I Love became a top 10 hit, I think that was a huge turning point in
Mm,
terms of labels' interest in this kind of music,
yeah,
and also realizing that you can use college radio as a springboard to the mainstream. There,
right.
there were other bands like whose also a lot of college radio was very Anglophile in the 80s, and
Yes.
by the late 80s, bands like The Cure and New Order were starting to get big enough to the point where they were having gold. Their albums were going gold
Right.
and the top 40. There were artists like Scooby and the Replacements that were huge on 80s college radio that never really broke through
Yeah.
commercially. But And then all of this kind of built up to Nirvana's breakthrough.
Right. And you get this breakthrough in Nirvana, and alt rock, really surging into the mainstream. And yes, it was a trickle, like you said, REM had hit, and The Cure, and a couple of other acts who actually, charted on the mainstream chart. But that awareness that everyone had when Nirvana, broke, really shifted a lot of the mainstream radio stations towards more alternative songs.
Yeah, it felt like Smells Like Teen Spirit, whatever you think of it as a song. It was like the American equivalent of Anarchy in the UK. And from that point, a lot of I remember hearing almost every song of Nevermind even on commercial radio when that album came out.
Yeah, yeah, and having gone to college right in this sweet spot of when there was such a thing as college rock, and the chart, the modern rock chart started, and all of that. It seemed like it did seem like a big sea change, I would say, but it didn't really it didn't register with me that there was any big difference until people I would run across who would otherwise have no idea who Husker Du was, or the Replacements, or anybody like that, were all of a sudden talking about these grunge acts, or these grunge adjacent acts like Smashing Pumpkins or somebody else. And that's when I realized, it took a good year for me to realize, oh no, now this is in the public consciousness. And then you had stations, which I believe the station in my area was DRE, I want to say it was, popping up and becoming dedicated strictly to alternative rock, and at the time were very eclectic. You would get some hip hop on there and other things like that. They weren't as eclectic as things can be today, especially online. But they hadn't been programmed to the point of being so strictured. And then mainstream stations started to copy those, and those stations were very tightly structured. And, oh, okay, we'll play a Pearl Jam, but we're not going to play I don't know, Mighty Boss Tones or somebody like that. They wouldn't go that far, or Fishbone. And so that mid 90s period where things really started to shift into the public consciousness, I feel like that had an effect, if not then slightly later on college radio itself.
Yeah, I'd also say college radio also, it's not associated with hip hop nearly to the extent it is with rock, but college radio also, mostly on specialty shows, played hip hop at a time when commercial radio wouldn't touch it, or they wouldn't touch anything except the biggest and safest songs. In
Yeah.
fact, the members of Public Enemy met on a college radio show at Adelphi University, and the around 1984, and the group, Chuck D, Flavor Flav, and the Bomb Squad, uh, did a show together, and
Wow.
and that became became the group eventually. And there was a radio show on WKCR at Columbia by these
Hmm.
DJs, Stretch and Babito, that later on, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, they had tons of underground rappers come up and do freestyles.
Yeah.
And I believe those guys founded the Fat Beats record store and label. The store is out of business now, but it sold nothing but hip hop. They had a store in the West Village.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, then that's something we haven't talked a lot about, which I'd like to get into more in the second half of the show, which is, how diverse really is college radio? What's it missing? And we've had that discussion before, and we'll get to that after the break. But just one more note before we get there, which is, even before we talk about that, we're kind of segueing into the mid late 90s when Clear Channel became a thing, and to me, not only did that shift the landscape, but and the co-opting or acceptance of alternative music in the mainstream shifted the landscape. But as you said, when you get to the late '90s into the 2000s, it changed the identity of college radio to a degree, and let's get into that after the break. Does that sound like a good idea?
Sure.
Okay, great. So, hey, everybody, we're coming up to the midpoint as usual. Thanks for hanging with us. So the more we talk about this subject, the more I want to talk about this subject. So, and as usual in these back talks, Steve is pulling out facts that I don't know how in the world you remember them. And I'm looking forward to hearing some more of those after we take this short break. So stick around. We'll be right back. Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Music is Not a Genre. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, if you'd like to learn more about the music I do with my band Rec or any other projects or anything else about me, go to nickdematteo.com. That's Nick, DEMATTEO.com. And everything is there. There's even a link to a merch store where you can get t-shirts and mugs and hats and totes and notebooks and so many other things. I'm always adding new products there. Great way to support the podcast. And finally, go to patreon.com/music is not a genre if you really like to show your support. My fans and lovely family there get exclusives and other perks and early releases, and they get to suggest topics for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening to the mid-roll. Now back to the show. All right, we are back with BackTalk with Steve Erickson, round 6 on college radio. And we are up to the late 90s, early 2000s. And you had said in your notes that there, things really shifted as far as college radio and its identity after the mainstream took over alt rock, and then it seemingly within 10 years kind of, into my mind, abandoned it in a lot of ways. What happened to college radio in that period?
It's funny. I've had a hard time researching this period. I think that there was a crisis because if commercial stations were playing the same records that you were, or they were playing the same bands that you were playing that only college stations would have played a few years ago, what do you play? And I'm not sure they college radio became a lot more marginal after that point. I think in some ways, it's positive to be. It can be positive to be detached from the mainstream and mostly play independent labels. I I think the idea of what alternative or indie meant that may have gotten a bit deeper after that point. Also, Napster started in 1999, and it first really took off on college campuses. They were some of the first places to have broadband. So a lot of college students were downloading music, and it became accessible without having to pay for. One thing I've found in my research is that it was actually often very difficult to get in the 70s and 80s to get major labels to send records to college stations. In the 1984 issue of the CMJ, where I found the chart we talked about, they have a letter section, and a lot of the letter section is pleading with. There are several people, station directors, pleading with CBS Records to send them promos, and I can sort of understand that because back then you had to mail physical copies of each album to the station.
Yeah.
So I picture the intern at CBS Records getting into a car with 300, at the post office with 300 packages of of records going to these stations. And of course, right now you can you can get a site that has a link, or if your music's on Bandcamp, you can give people a link to download up there for free, and you don't have to pay anything. You don't have to pay postage to send physical media to college stations. But of course, the cost of sending out hundreds of records I think also if say you were a band who pressed 1,000 copies of your 7 inch,
Mhm.
also sending out 100 copies to college stations was not that feasible. If there were ones in your community that might be open to it, or if you knew that there were some that would be willing to play it, I'm sure they sent out, but they would, I don't know, out of that pressing, they would send out maybe 20. And so I think starting with Napster, our access to music really widened up. I realized that with the
Yeah.
show that I'm doing now,
Mhm.
I play a lot of music from Latin America and Africa.
Mm.
And a lot of that is on Bandcamp, or or I rip MP3s from
Yeah.
YouTube clips. And basically when music is released anywhere in the world these days, it's immediately available in the entire world. And that I can imagine if you were doing a show devoted to African music in the 70s, how how small your choices would be, unless you, unless you if you lived in a city that had a say a community from Nigeria, or
Yeah.
otherwise you were
Imports.
much dependent on whatever imports you could find,
Yeah.
and a really tiny amount of music that American labels were were, were releasing. Even with reggae, um, there were,
Yeah.
yeah, until the late
Yeah.
'70s, I think it would probably be difficult to do a 2 hour reggae show in America based
Mm.
on the music you had access to.
That's a great point. That's something we forget quite easily, and I didn't even think of when we were talking about that period. And even throughout, I mean, when I would, check out the record bins or CDs or cassettes in the 80s and 90s, there were certain stores you went to where you knew that they would have imports, or, someone who had that sold it to them, and that was this rare find. But there was, it took quite a while to be able to go online and find anything like that. And I guess that's where we are in the history now for, stretching into the 2000s, how prior to, streaming blowing up, MP3s blew up, and whether you were downloading them through, Napster or LimeWire or FrostWire or whatever, or actually buying them, that's how a lot of people got the more obscure music, because it was possible for somebody in a different country to upload something that there was no other way that you could possibly get. And and then, of course, with the advent of streaming, or in YouTube in particular, YouTube just very slowly, and now much more quickly, became populated with things that you can't even find on streaming. So it's much easier to find more obscure music. And I think my question there is, when you were a college radio station in the 80s, you kind of knew what to play and where to go. The Smiths and the Femmes and Husker Du and Susie and the Banshees and whatever else. And even in the 90s, you kind of had some idea, and you might have scratched your head more because you were wondering, well, why are the mainstream stations doing the same thing? And for the couple of years that they did. And then obscure music became so much easier to find in the next decade or two, that it maybe is an answer to the question already. But do you feel like there was a point at which, or that college radio kind of transitioned from finding great music that wasn't mainstream, that was on an indie label or what have you, or even maybe some local band or something, to feeling a sense of almost one-upmanship, where, well, all of this music is available now, so I have to find music that's even more obscure, that's even harder to find, that the mainstream people would hate or wouldn't even pay attention to, that it in its own way segregated itself from the rest of the music world in a way that college radio wasn't segregated in the 70s and 80s and the 90s, to where it's there are certain, program listings, and we've talked about this offline or off the show, where the list of songs that a college, radio station or that the CMJ puts out as the top is different from mainstream, and certainly, uh, broader in many ways, but in other ways, it is kind of narrow. It doesn't necessarily represent the breadth of eclecticism that's out there. And to me, in some ways, more restrictive than it's been in a long time.
Well, one thing I found is that a lot of college stations these days just don't make charts anymore.
Oh,
So I think that may be reflected in what you're seeing. CMJ went out of business, I think around 2016. Currently, there's a website called NAC and NACC that does a weekly college radio top 200, and it's hard to say because in the 2000s you had bands like the Shins and Vampire Weekend and Arcade Fire, and around the beginning of the decade, the White Stripes and the Strokes, who kind of had a foothold in both worlds. I
yes.
think the difference maybe is that groups like Arcade Fire and Vampire Weekend were huge, but they didn't get much radio play on commercial stations.
Mm,
Uh,
yeah. And that's true. You sent me that chart from the NACC, I think, and also sent a chart from, was it Billboard?
yeah,
And I was honestly surprised that there wasn't more crossover between those two charts.
yeah. White Legs' current single was the only song on both.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, but I think a lot of that is because commercial radio basically, commer iHeartRadio really has a huge monopoly.
Hmm.
They when I also looked up playlists of alternative stations, and they're just classic rock for a different generation. It like 50 to 60% of the music they play is from the 90s or the 2000s.
Yeah.
So they're not out there looking for. I don't see that. I don't think they're combing the college radio charts looking for bands to add. I think if labels promote some of those bands, they'll play them.
Yes.
Fontaines DC are another band. They didn't happen to be on the NAC chart I sent you, but they're doing quite well in both college and commercial alternative radio.
Okay.
But um, and another big switch is that like the chart in 1984, all of the albums in the top 10 on college radio were on major labels. And in fact, there were only five albums on indie labels in
Mm.
the top 40. And on this week's college radio chart, the entire top 10 is on indie labels. And there's only one artist on a full-fledged major label in the whole top 30.
Yeah, that is a big shift. And as we mentioned, some of those indie labels are smaller and truly very indie, and some are owned by major labels, but they do offer a pretty diverse range of music. And we're going to shift into talking about where you're working soon, and how college radio is sort of a sister to independent radio in a lot of ways. I wonder, in either case, how do we fare? People like us, Rec, you do music as calling a magician, and or anyone who is unsigned, making their own music. What are their odds of being, able to get on any, radio show, college or independent?
Well, I've never managed it. I mean, I think the problem is that not that it's a problem exactly that it's so easy to make music these days
Mm.
and to put it on Bandcamp, but I know as a music writer, I must get 20 press releases a day uh, regarding music, and even more on Friday when new albums come out.
Yeah.
And those stations probably get two or three times that. So if you're getting 300 emails a day saying, listen to my music, you're probably going to listen to labels that have a track record
Right.
and where you have a sense of where they're coming from, rather than someone might be sending you great music completely out of the blue by themselves. But if 100 other people's, uh, I mean, honestly,
Yeah.
occasionally I'll randomly listen to things people send me themselves out of the blue, and I've never liked much of it.
Yeah.
I feel guilty saying that, and I'm sure that people have probably sent me great music I've never listened to, but it's just impossible to. There's such a glut that it's really impossible to
Yeah.
dig through all of that. So I wouldn't really blame the stations. I think it's kind of I think it's kind of a product of the changes that streaming and the move. I think
Yeah.
also forms of independent radio are much more important than college radio now. And most of the what people think of as college radio now is really community radio. Often, even
Hmm.
if it's tied to a college, often most of the DJs are not students.
Yeah. And I want to make a quick comment about what you said just prior to that before we shift into exactly what you're talking about. This is independent radio. And that is that I was a music director for quite a number of years for a film company. And so I'm listed on some sites as that. And I still get several emails every day from artists looking for sync placement. And I can see how overwhelming it is to get these emails and links and the music hasn't been vetted in any way. You don't, you know, like you said, if it's coming from even a small label or if other people have been mentioning it in any way, you know, oh, okay, there must be some quality there. And my thought as a creator is, well, okay, so what? You know, the independent people and they could be just as, you know, good quality or whatever. I've had a hard time finding good music out of those, you know, submissions. So I can understand from that point of view how you know, the barrier that there would be for someone with that job to be able to sift through all that and find even one good thing. But that's something you've been doing because you have had a show on Mixcloud for a few weeks. And again, the link will be up. And now you will be debuting a show on East Village Radio.
Yeah, the show on Mixcloud began in March. I posted 6 episodes there. The most recent one went up June 1st. And tomorrow, actually, I'll be reporting to the station for a training session. And it looks like my first show. This isn't completely set in stone yet, but my first show will probably be this coming Saturday, which will be the 14th. And I'll from it's if it's not then it'll be on the 21st. But my I'll be on from 4 to 6 p.m. every other Saturday.
So to explain to people, and again, if I put the Mixcloud link up, whenever your show debuts, will they be able to find the show there?
Yeah, East Village Radio archives all of its archives every single show that they air.
Okay.
Uh,
And what's the name of your show?
Radio, not radio.
So it's Radio Not Radio, Steve Erickson on East Village Radio. So if whenever it's the 14th or the 21st, this show episode is debuting on the 16th. So it will be, you know, there, if not already, then very soon. Check out, either search, as I said, for Steve Erickson Radio Not Radio on East Village Radio, or just click the Mixcloud link and find it. What do you play on your show?
Well, I actually wrote a description, a one sentence description of the show for their website, where I said it was like riding up and down a roller coaster of sound, and I listed several things I play, including post punk, psychedelia, jazz, hip hop, ballet funk, Afro pop. I I think I listed a few other things, but
Nice.
it really spans a very wide gamut. Typically, the show is 2 hours long. The one side, it because this is on a radio station, it has to be. exactly 2 hours going forward.
Mm.
The first show I did in Mixcloud was about 2 hours and 15 minutes.
Ah,
They've been getting shorter. The sixth one was about 100 minutes.
okay.
But the idea, a lot of it is trying to organize music by mood rather than style. Particularly doing, typically the shows are divided into 4 sets, each of which is about 25 minutes,
Mm.
and typically about 6 songs each. And I'll do a set of music that's kind of spacey and drifting, and then the next set will be music that's angry and often kind of politically charged.
Mm.
So I've got most of the playlist for my first show on East Village Radio. I've got all but a few songs. I'm completed. I need to know the technical details. Like I registered for the website the station uses to broadcast yesterday, but I don't know how to actually broadcast through it. Uh, and but I have at least for for the first show, all the music will be coming from my laptop, and I have a folder with MP3s or FLACs of almost every song that I plan to play.
Mm.
Um,
Incredible.
so it's a really extreme mix. I'm playing the soundtrack to the Andromeda Strain.
Oh,
I'm playing a very aggressive hip hop song that's basically 90 seconds of someone shouting over noise.
yeah. Mhm.
Uh, there's really, as I said earlier, it's going to end with Sly and the Family Stone, but
Yes.
I try to cover a very wide range of genres and countries. One idea behind the show is to try to do that without calling it world music or global music is kind of the current term, but
Yeah.
then it's kind of ghettoizing it and also suggesting that, say, music from France and Zimbabwe have something in common just because they're not in English.
Yeah,
So,
I did an episode a few years ago on that, just kind of stating, oh, all music is world music. It that you shouldn't ghettoize it in that way. But it seems like you're not ghettoizing anything because that's a just in the few types of songs you mentioned, you're already going all over the place, which is that's my favorite kind of program.
yeah, I'm hoping to put all these kinds of music in dialogue with each other. And there's also, given what's happening in America right now, there's definitely a political undertone to trying to play music from around the world. There's a song by a Palestinian producer that'll be on my next show. I played it throughout. I've been playing music by Arab artists, including songs about the war in Gaza.
Ooh,
And
wow.
I mean, you can see how normalized racism and xenophobia have become, even just since Trump took power in January. I
Yeah.
look at what's happening in LA now, and look at people being deliberately starved in Gaza. I have no delusions that what I'm doing is activism or that it's going to make any kind of political have any kind of political effect. But at the same time, I'm a person who's reacting to what's happening in America and the world, and so are a lot of musicians. And the show definitely reflects that.
Yeah. I mean, it has been said, and agree or disagree, that art can be a political act just by the nature of its inclusion, and let's say if you're watching a show that has diverse casting and or like you said, doing a radio program that is, grabbing music from all over the world, and some of it might be political or not, but the fact that you're playing it is itself a statement because this reactionary, climate that we live in, full well that there are programs out there that are going to be hardline one kind of music from one kind of people, let's say, and that's that. So, no, you might not be changing the world with what you're doing, but you are making a statement by the way that you're doing it.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a lot easier to dehumanize people if you never listen to them speak for themselves.
Yeah.
And I think it astonishes me how most Americans have probably never seen a film that's subtitled, or or say until this has changed a bit in the last couple of years with people like Bad Bunny becoming huge. But how many people, say before 10 years ago, how many people would never listen to music and many Americans specifically would never listen to music in a language other than English, or
Mm,
outside the US, the UK, and Canada, and I'm
yes.
also aware of this. There's uh, in college radio, there's kind of a polite degree of racism to it may be completely unconscious, but I think this has changed a bit because I don't think that in, indie rock is necessarily the format, or but there was when I was listening to WHUS in the 80s, Fishbone and Bad Brains were the only black artists that they would play on rock shows.
Yeah, yeah. And yet, yeah, that actually answers the question that I asked earlier about how, that kind of narrow band that college radio is relying on right now. I think I mentioned that it might even have been last year, or earlier this year, when you sent me a chart, and I noticed that, for want of a better word, it was very white chart. And no, it wasn't fully, it was more, somewhat more diverse than that. But you are still seeing, this is indie pop, this is indie rock, this is indie folk, and it doesn't, there are certain things it doesn't include, or let's say that we know of, at least chart wise, that if they included it, would, I think, make it more representative of what, to me, college radio has at times been and could be and maybe should be, and more representative of all of the people who are listening to it.
Yeah, uh, Lil Sims just released a new album on last Friday, so we'll see how that does on the Knack chart. But
Oh,
yeah, I'm surprised that hip hop rarely turns up there. Although we're only seeing the top 30, and the chart goes as far as the top 200. Although
right.
you pay a yearly subscription to see the entire chart, but yeah, it is surprising to me that people don't dip further.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we're gonna wrap up in a minute. But the fact that there's been, indie hip hop for decades now. There's been an indie version of every kind of music that you can think of. It now exists, and all of that has not just not it, it has a right to be on college radio, but to me, I feel like that should be the place where it shows up more than anything or
Uh,
anywhere else.
yeah, I mean, again, I think this is part of the issue of charts that the more freeform stations may not even make charts.
Yeah.
In fact, from my research, it seems to, for instance, East Village Radio does not make any charts.
Right.
So it generally seems like the more adventurous the station is, the uh, oh, we only have 10 minutes left.
Ah, it's okay. Keep talking.
Oh, sorry, I got thrown off.
But that's okay. I think I kind of want to, wrap up this discussion by saying a couple of things quickly, which is that college radio is itself diverse, and as you mentioned, don't just rely on what the charts say to find out what's out there, because there are plenty of stations and individual programs and DJs who are playing far more diverse things than you will see on those charts. And yes, just like with any institution or whatever you want to call it, it can use some improvement and diversification. It is still, far more diverse than what you're going to hear on mainstream radio by a long stretch. And I would include some independent stations in that as well. I think they kind of go both ways. But that if you are someone who listens to your music online, frankly, like me, I stream. That's pretty much it. I'll find things on YouTube now and then as well. I don't do a lot of listening of physical at all, if any. And the only time I listen to the radio is when I'm in a car and I don't have a car. So, that's a quandary. But I do tune in as much as I can when I can. It's worth seeking out these smaller stations to for even 5 minutes to hear something that you may not have heard otherwise.
And I think every station is available on live streams these days. I would
Even better.
I would just throw out the names of some stations, and as I'm about to say this, I realize that none of these are actually college radio. They're
Okay.
all community or internet-based stations. But I would really recommend WFMU, which is maybe the most legendary college station. It's not affiliated with the college anymore, but started out at Uppsala College in East Orange. And I would recommend KEXP, which broadcasts out of Seattle and the Bay Area, and then East Village Radio, of course. A couple of Brit stations based out of the UK, NTS and Resonance FM, and Dandelion Radio.
Mm, excellent. This is great. I love the recommendations. Please take them, and yes, please remember that you can find all of this online. I would never have been able to listen to an independent Seattle station, 10, maybe 15, 20, 30 years ago for sure. Thank you for hanging with me, and thank you for all your knowledge on this really interesting subject.
You're welcome. It was great speaking with you.
Yeah, great speaking with you as well. Please, everybody, click the link. Check out Steve's show, Mixcloud and East Village Radio. If it's not broadcast already, it's upcoming very, very soon. And thank you, as always, for watching and listening. My objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. And I will talk to you next week.